It was the trial that had the whole city holding its breath. A young black boy, just 14, sat in the courtroom, his face a mixture of fear and determination. His best friend had been wrongfully accused. The evidence against him fabricated by powerful men determined to protect their own corruption. Everyone in the room knew the odds were stacked against them, the system was rigged. And justice felt like an impossible dream. But then, the boy stood up. The courtroom fell silent as he faced the judge. His small frame a stark contrast to the towering injustice surrounding him. His hands trembled, but his voice was clear when he uttered just 2 words. "He's innocent." For a moment, the judge froze, his face turning pale. The boy's words weren't just a declaration, they were a challenge. A crack in the carefully constructed wall of lies that had protected the guilty for so long. And those 2 words set off a chain of events that would change everything. Exposing truths no one thought would ever see the light of day. Stay with me, this is a story of courage, resilience, and the undeniable power of speaking truth to power. Let us know where you're watching from today. And if this inspires you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. The city of Northside was not always like this. There was a time when its streets were lined with hope, where families laughed on their porches, and neighbors exchanged smiles as they passed one another. But the years had dulled that glow, replacing it with a harsh reality where silence grew like weeds in a garden left untended. Power, here, was not in loud declarations but in the quiet, calculated grip of corruption, fed by fear and sustained by the sharp edge of prejudice. Elijah Reed, a wiry 14-year-old with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets of a world far older than him, walked home from basketball practice that evening. The rhythmic sound of the ball bouncing on the cracked pavement felt like a heartbeat. Steady and reassuring. Beside him, his best friend Marcus Taylor, tall and full of a confidence that Elijah admired, spun the ball effortlessly on his finger. The 2 boys, dressed in their worn basketball jerseys, were heading home through the only neighborhood they had ever known, a place where the weight of being young and black was a burden they bore without ever being taught how to carry it. "Man, one day, I'm gonna get out of here," Marcus said, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of dream and defiance. "Go pro. Buy my mom a house in the suburbs with a big yard and a real basketball hoop. None of this backboard on a tree nonsense." Elijah smiled faintly, his thoughts quieter. "You could. You know. You're good enough." Marcus laughed, a sound so full of life it made the faded streetlights seem a little brighter. "And you'll be right there with me. Jay, my manager or something. Making sure I don't blow it all on cars and sneakers." Elijah shrugged. He didn't have the same big dreams. His ambitions were smaller, more immediate, like making it home before dark without catching the wrong kind of attention. As they passed Mr. Green's corner store, something about the scene inside made Elijah pause. Through the smeared glass window, he saw a man in an expensive suit leaning against the counter, speaking in hushed tones to Mr. Green. The store owner, usually so robust with cheer, looked pale and uneasy. Elijah's steps slowed, his senses pricking with a warning he couldn't quite name. "You see that?" he asked, nudging Marcus. Marcus, still spinning the ball, barely glanced. "What, old man Green? He probably forgot to pay his taxes or something." But Elijah didn't laugh. He couldn't shake the image of the man in the suit. His posture too confident, his presence too out of place in this neighborhood. Before Elijah could say more, the door to the store burst open, and a man in a ski mask sprinted out, clutching a small brown package. His movements were sharp, deliberate, like he knew exactly what he was doing. The masked man barely spared the boys a glance as he disappeared down the alleyway. The air seemed to still for a moment, the street unnaturally quiet. "Whoa," Marcus whispered, his voice low. "That was weird." Then came the sirens. 2 police cars screeched around the corner, their lights flashing but sirens curiously muted. The officers moved with unsettling precision, as though they had already decided where to go and who to target. Elijah barely had time to react before they were upon them. "Get on the ground, hands where I can see them." The shout echoed off the walls, loud and sharp. Marcus, confused, dropped his basketball, which rolled into the gutter. "We didn't do anything," Elijah tried to say, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. One of the officers tackled Marcus, pinning him to the ground. Elijah watched in horror as his friend's face hit the pavement with a sickening crack. Blood smeared the concrete, a cruel contrast to Marcus's wide, terrified eyes. "Wait," Elijah shouted, stepping forward. "He didn't do anything. We were just coming from practice." "Stay back," another officer barked, shoving Elijah so hard he stumbled. "Unless you want to join him." Marcus struggled, his voice breaking as he pleaded. "We didn't, please. I didn't do anything." But the officers weren't listening. They cuffed Marcus with mechanical efficiency, dragging him to his feet like a bag of trash. Elijah's protests died in his throat as he caught sight of the black sedan parked across the street. The man in the suit sat inside, watching. Their eyes met, and Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. The man's gaze was cold, calculating, a silent warning that needed no words: stay quiet. As the patrol car doors slammed shut and Marcus was taken away, Elijah stood frozen on the sidewalk. His hands trembled, his mind racing. The street, once familiar, now felt hostile, every shadow hiding a threat. The man in the suit started his car and drove off, the tinted windows rolling up like a curtain closing on a stage. The open sign in Mr. Green's store had been flipped to closed. Everything about the moment felt deliberate, orchestrated. Elijah walked home in a daze, replaying the scene over and over. The police didn't even ask questions. They didn't check the store. They didn't look at him, except to shove him aside. It was as if they already knew who they wanted. And it didn't matter what the truth was. When he got home, his mother, Ruth, was just leaving for her night shift at the diner. She stopped when she saw his face, her usual briskness softening with concern. "What happened, baby?" she asked, her voice steady but full of worry. Elijah told her everything, his words tumbling out in a rush. Ruth listened, her face growing darker with each detail. When he finished, she sighed, sitting heavily at the small kitchen table. "Baby," she said, her voice low, "this ain't new. They see boys like Marcus, like you, and they don't see kids. They see trouble. It don't matter what the truth is, they've already made up their minds." "But he didn't do anything, Mama." Elijah's voice cracked with frustration. "They're saying he robbed the store. But we were at practice. Coach Wilson can tell them. There's gotta be cameras at the school." Ruth reached for his hand, her grip firm. "I know, baby, I know. But this ain't just about Marcus. It's about the system, about how they keep us scared, keep us quiet. They don't want you asking questions." Elijah stared at her, anger and fear churning in his chest. "So what do we do?" For a long moment, Ruth didn't answer. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if weighing the risk of telling her son the truth against the risk of keeping him in the dark. "We stay smart," she said finally, "and we stay together. But promise me, Elijah, don't you go doing anything reckless. You hear me? They already watching us." That night, Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what he'd seen, what he'd felt, pressed heavy on him. Outside, a car with tinted windows idled on the street before driving away slowly. The message was clear. They were watching. And yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred, a quiet, simmering resolve. Marcus was innocent, and Elijah couldn't let the world believe otherwise. He didn't know how yet, but he knew this much: he wouldn't stay silent. If you agree with the courage and determination shown by our main character in standing up for what's right, press 1 now and show your support. The morning after Marcus's arrest dawned with a brittle chill, the kind that settles not just in the air but in the marrow of things. Elijah Reed woke to the sound of his mother, Ruth, shuffling around the kitchen, humming softly to herself as if to create a bubble of normalcy in a world that no longer felt stable. The sun streamed weakly through the cracks in the curtains, illuminating the worn furniture of their small apartment, each object carrying a memory that seemed both comforting and suffocating. Elijah sat at the table, pushing his cereal around the bowl. His appetite was gone, replaced by a gnawing guilt. He should have done something, should have shouted louder, should have fought harder. The image of Marcus's face pressed against the pavement, blood streaking the ground, wouldn't leave his mind. "Eat," Ruth said gently as she passed by, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You can't think on an empty stomach." He nodded, though the food turned to ash in his mouth. His mother's voice carried an edge of worry, hidden beneath the surface, like a river flowing just out of sight. She didn't need to say it out loud. He knew she was afraid. Not just for Marcus but for him too. After breakfast, Elijah grabbed his backpack and made his way to school. The walk felt different now. The streets that had once seemed familiar were now laced with unease. Every passing car, every glance from a stranger, carried the weight of suspicion. He noticed the subtle ways people looked at him and then looked away, as if seeing him was an act of courage they couldn't quite muster. At school, the air was thick with tension. Marcus's absence hung over their group of friends like a storm cloud. In the locker room before gym class, Elijah overheard snippets of conversation. "I heard he robbed the store," one boy whispered. "Nah, Marcus wouldn't do that," another said. "He's not like that." "But the police arrested him, right? They don't arrest people for no reason." Elijah clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up, but he forced himself to stay quiet. He wanted to scream, to tell them all how wrong they were. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he felt the heavy, familiar weight of injustice settle on his shoulders, the kind that came from knowing that no matter how much he screamed, some people would never listen. By lunchtime, Elijah couldn't take it anymore. He skipped the cafeteria and made his way to the library, a place where the world felt quieter, more manageable. He sat in the farthest corner, flipping through a textbook he wasn't really reading, when a shadow fell across his table. "Mind if I sit?" Elijah looked up to see Angela Brooks, a woman he recognized from around the neighborhood. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and a notepad always in hand. People said she was a journalist, though no one seemed to know exactly for whom she worked. "What do you want?" Elijah asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Angela sat without waiting for an answer. "I heard about what happened to your friend Marcus," she said. "It's wrong, and I want to help." Elijah studied her for a moment, unsure whether to trust her. "Why do you care?" Angela leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "Because this isn't just about Marcus. It's about all of us. They're using your friend as a scapegoat. And if we don't fight back, they'll keep doing it, over and over again." Elijah hesitated. Her words rang true, but they also felt dangerous, like stepping out onto thin ice. "What can you do?" he asked finally. Angela smiled faintly. "I can give you the tools to fight, but it has to start with you." That evening, Elijah returned to the corner store where it had all begun. Mr. Green was behind the counter, his face lined with exhaustion. The store was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. Elijah approached cautiously. "Mr. Green," he said, his voice steady, "I need to talk to you." The older man looked up, his eyes narrowing. "About what?" "About what really happened that night." Mr. Green's expression tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Elijah pressed. "I saw the man in the suit. I saw the package. You know Marcus didn't do it." Mr. Green's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "You don't understand, boy. You don't know how things work." "Then explain it to me," Elijah said, his voice rising, "because all I see is my friend locked up for something he didn't do, while the real criminals walk free." Mr. Green glanced around nervously, as if the walls themselves might be listening. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to drop this. For your own good. People who ask too many questions around here, they don't last long." Elijah felt a surge of frustration. "So you're just going to let them get away with it? You're just going to stay quiet?" Mr. Green didn't answer. His silence said everything. Walking home that night, Elijah's thoughts churned like a storm. The weight of the system, of the silence that enabled it, felt suffocating. How could one voice his voice possibly make a difference? As he approached his apartment building, he noticed a black car parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, and its engine idled softly, like a predator lying in wait. Elijah quickened his pace, his heart pounding. He could feel the eyes watching him, though he couldn't see them. When he reached his door, he turned back. The car hadn't moved. The message was clear. They were watching. Inside, Ruth was waiting for him, her arms crossed. "Where've you been?" she demanded, her voice sharp with worry. "I went to talk to Mr. Green," Elijah admitted. Ruth's eyes widened. "Elijah, I told you to be careful. These people, they don't play fair." "I know," he said, his voice firm, "but Marcus needs me. Someone has to do something." Ruth sighed, pulling him into a tight hug. "You're brave, baby, but bravery can be dangerous. Promise me you'll be smart about this." Elijah nodded, though his resolve had only hardened. The fear was real, but so was the injustice. And for Marcus, for his family, for his community, Elijah knew he couldn't back down. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling. Elijah felt the first embers of something larger begin to burn within him. Fear might have kept others silent, but it would not keep him silent. Not anymore. The morning was gray, the kind of overcast sky that felt like a reflection of the unease gripping Elijah Reed's world. School had become a battleground, not in the traditional sense of fists or harsh words, but in the subtler, more insidious way that silence and assumptions poisoned the air. Elijah sat in history class, his pencil idly tracing lines on the edge of his notebook. The lesson blurred into the background as he scanned the room. The usual cliques clustered together, their laughter and whispers muted. Every so often, he caught someone glancing at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. The whispers about Marcus had spread like wildfire, fanned by the ever-present shadow of racial bias. "Hey," a girl named Sarah leaned over, her voice low but not unkind. "Is it true? About Marcus?" Elijah's jaw tightened. He knew the question wasn't malicious. Sarah had always been one of the friendlier faces in class, but the weight of it, the implication that Marcus might be guilty simply because of who he was, stung. "No," Elijah said firmly, his voice sharper than he intended. "It's not true." Sarah hesitated, then nodded, retreating to her side of the desk. But the doubt in her eyes lingered, and Elijah could feel it like a thorn under his skin. At lunch, Elijah found himself alone. The usual group that he and Marcus sat with seemed to scatter whenever he approached. It wasn't outright hostility, but something worse, avoidance. The unspoken belief that staying close to Elijah might make them targets too. Angela Brooks's words echoed in his mind. "They're using Marcus as a scapegoat. This isn't just about him, it's about keeping all of you in line." Elijah clenched his fists under the table, anger simmering beneath the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's arrest was just the beginning. A warning shot fired at an entire community. He had to act. But how? That evening, Elijah found himself standing outside Angela's modest office. A converted storefront with frosted windows and a simple sign that read, "Independent Investigations." His heart pounded as he knocked, wondering if he was about to dive too deep into waters he wasn't prepared to navigate. Angela opened the door, her sharp eyes immediately softening when she saw him. "Elijah," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I was hoping you'd come." Inside, the space was cluttered but organized. Papers and maps tacked to the walls. A whiteboard covered in names and dates. It smelled faintly of coffee and ink. Angela gestured for him to sit as she rifled through a stack of folders. "What can I do?" Elijah asked, his voice trembling slightly. "How do we prove Marcus didn't do it?" Angela sat across from him, leaning forward with an intensity that was both reassuring and daunting. "It's not just about proving he didn't do it. It's about exposing the people who made sure he got blamed." She slid a folder toward him, filled with documents and photographs. "Look at this. The man in the suit you saw? His name is Richard Hayes. He's tied to several cases just like this, false accusations, planted evidence, young black men scapegoated to cover up larger crimes." Elijah's stomach turned as he flipped through the pages. Each story felt like a mirror of Marcus's, a chilling reminder of how deep the problem ran. "But why?" Elijah asked. "Why go after people like Marcus?" "Because it's easy," Angela said bluntly. "Because the system was built to work this way. When people like Hayes get caught up in something illegal, drugs, money laundering, whatever, they need a distraction, someone to take the fall. And they know the world is quick to believe the worst about boys like Marcus." Elijah swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy coat. "So what do we do?" Angela smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "We shine a light on it. We gather evidence. We tell the truth. And we make sure it's too big for them to ignore." Angela's plan started small. She gave Elijah a list of questions to ask and people to talk to: neighbors, classmates, anyone who might have seen or heard something the night of Marcus's arrest. At first, the conversations were uneventful, filled with nervous denials or vague recollections. But then, one name kept coming up: Mr. Green. Elijah returned to the corner store, this time with Angela by his side. Mr. Green looked up from behind the counter, his face tightening when he saw them. "I already told the police everything I know," he said, his tone defensive. "And what exactly did you tell them?" Angela asked, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Green hesitated, his eyes darting to the security cameras mounted in the corners of the store. That Marcus came in, argued with me, and then left. That's all. And is that the truth? Angela pressed, stepping closer. Because we've heard otherwise. Mr. Green's hand trembled as he adjusted his glasses. I don't want any trouble. You already have trouble, Angela said, her voice hardening. The question is, do you want to be on the right side of it? The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Mr. Green sighed, his shoulders slumping. I didn't see Marcus do anything. He admitted, he wasn't even inside the store. But that man, Hayes, he came in earlier. Said he needed me to keep quiet. Said it was for my own good. Elijah's heart raced. Did you see what Hayes was carrying? Did he leave anything behind? Mr. Green hesitated, then nodded. He handed me a package. Told me to lock it in the back. The police took it when they came. Angela's eyes narrowed. And did you tell them it came from Hayes? No, Mr. Green said quickly, his voice trembling. He said if I mentioned his name, I'd regret it. The walk back to Angela's office was quiet. The gravity of what they'd learned pressing down on both of them. Elijah couldn't shake the image of Marcus sitting in a cold cell, paying for someone else's crime. They're going to come after him, aren't they? Elijah asked finally. Hayes and his people? Angela nodded grimly. If they think you're a threat. Yes, that's why we have to move fast. What if they come after you? Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela stopped, placing a hand on his shoulder. That's a risk I'm willing to take. But you need to be ready. Elijah, this won't be easy. Once we start pulling at this thread, everything could unravel. Elijah nodded, the fear in his chest warring with a growing resolve. He thought of Marcus, of Ruth, of all the people in their neighborhood who had been taught to accept injustice as the price of survival. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady. Angela smiled faintly. Good, because the fight starts now. The morning began quietly, deceptively so, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Elijah Reed sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. His mother, Ruth, moved around the room with an air of forced normalcy. The clinking of dishes and the soft hum of her gospel tunes an attempt to drown out the tension lingering in the air. Angela called this morning, Ruth said finally, breaking the silence. She said you two found something. Something big. Elijah nodded but didn't look up. The weight of the truth they'd uncovered the night before still sat heavy on his chest. Hayes wasn't just another man in a suit, he was a puppeteer, pulling strings that reached far beyond Marcus's arrest. And now that Elijah and Angela had started pulling at those threads, the entire tapestry of corruption was beginning to unravel. Are you sure about this, baby? Ruth's voice softened as she sat across from him. This isn't just schoolyard trouble. These are powerful people, dangerous people. Elijah met her gaze, his own steady despite the fear swirling inside him. I don't have a choice. Mama, if I don't do something, who will? Ruth sighed, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Just promise me you'll be careful. The world's not fair, Elijah. It never has been. But that doesn't mean you throw yourself into its fire without a plan. At Angela's office later that day, the mood was tense. The small space, usually cluttered but calm, felt like a war room now. Papers were spread across the desk. Photographs pinned to the walls with red string connecting names, places, and dates. At the center of it all was Hayes, his face circled in bold red ink. We have a lead, Angela said as Elijah walked in. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. The package Hayes left at Green's store? I pulled some strings. Turns out, the police didn't log it as evidence. It disappeared. Disappeared? Elijah echoed, anger flaring. How does evidence just disappear? Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. It doesn't, not without help. She gestured to a name on the board. Officer Daniels. Daniels was the lead on Marcus's arrest. He's been involved in several cases like this, cases where evidence goes missing. Witnesses change their stories, and young black men take the fall. He's the next thread we pull. Elijah felt a cold knot form in his stomach. So, what do? We make him talk, Angela said, her tone sharp. But we have to be smart about it. Daniels isn't going to just confess. We need leverage. That evening, Elijah found himself in a part of the city he rarely visited. Angela had traced Daniels to a bar on the edge of town, a dimly lit place frequented by off-duty cops and city officials. The kind of place where deals were made in whispers over glasses of cheap whiskey. Are you sure about this? Elijah whispered as they stood across the street. The bar's neon sign flickering ominously in the distance. No, Angela admitted, but if we're going to expose this, we have to take risks. Stay close to me, and don't say a word unless I tell you to. The bar smelled of smoke and stale beer. The hum of conversation punctuated by bursts of raucous laughter. Angela scanned the room quickly, her sharp eyes locking onto a man at the far end of the bar. Daniels was exactly what Elijah had imagined, broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by years of authority and a smirk that spoke of impunity. Angela approached with a confidence that made Elijah marvel. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice cutting through the din. "Mind if we talk?" Daniels looked up, his smirk faltering slightly as he took her in. "Who's asking?" "Angela Brooks," she said, sliding into the seat beside him. "And this is my colleague, Elijah." Elijah stiffened at the word colleague but followed her lead, sitting silently as Angela continued. "I'm working on a story about the Green case. You know, the one involving Marcus Taylor." Daniels's smirk returned, sharper now. "Not interested. You should be," Angela said, her tone icy. "Because I know about Hayes. I know about the package. And I know about you." Daniels's jaw tightened, his hand clenching around his glass. "You don't know anything, don't I?" Angela leaned closer, her voice lowering but gaining intensity. "I know you've been covering for Hayes for years. I know you've helped make evidence disappear. And I know that the higher-ups you're protecting won't hesitate to throw you under the bus if this blows up." The tension in the room shifted, a palpable crackle of unease as Daniels stared at her. Elijah held his breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "What do you want?" Daniels finally asked, his voice a low growl. "The truth," Angela said simply. "Tell me where the package went. And I'll make sure your name doesn't end up on the front page." Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting to Elijah for the first time. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, of guilt. Maybe even shame. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling heavily. "They took it to the warehouse on 14th Street. He muttered. "It's where Hayes runs most of his operations. But you didn't hear that from me." Angela smiled faintly, standing. "Pleasure doing business with you." As they walked out of the bar, Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. The air outside felt sharper, colder, as though the world itself was reacting to what they'd just learned. "Do you think he'll warn Hayes?" Elijah asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Probably," Angela admitted, "but it doesn't matter. We have the location. And now, we have a chance to expose everything." The warehouse on 14th Street loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the night sky. Angela parked a few blocks away, her hands steady on the wheel despite the tension in the air. "This is it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "If Hayes is hiding anything, it'll be here." Elijah nodded, his fear warring with determination. The quiet of the night felt oppressive, every shadow a potential threat. But he knew there was no turning back. As they approached the warehouse, a sudden sound shattered the silence, the low rumble of an approaching car. Angela pulled Elijah behind a stack of crates as headlights swept across the street. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop outside the warehouse, and Hayes stepped out, flanked by two men in suits. Elijah's breath caught as he recognized the man who had watched Marcus's arrest with cold detachment. This was the man who had orchestrated everything, who had turned their lives into pawns in his game. "Stay here," Angela whispered. "I'll get closer." Elijah watched as she crept toward the warehouse, her movements careful and deliberate. The door opened, and Hayes disappeared inside, leaving the two men to stand guard. Elijah felt his pulse quicken. The quiet tension of the night had erupted into a cacophony of fear. The stakes higher than ever. But beneath the fear, a spark of resolve burned. Elijah knew that this moment, this risk, was the only way to bring the truth to light. The night seemed to stretch infinitely, the stars dimmed by the haze of city lights. Elijah Reed crouched low behind a rusted stack of metal drums, his breath shallow, his heart pounding like a drumbeat. The warehouse on 14th Street stood before him, a hulking monument to secrets and silence. Its broken windows were like unblinking eyes, daring him to step closer, to uncover what lay hidden within its walls. Angela Brooks was somewhere inside, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew the weight of every step. She had left Elijah outside with strict instructions to stay put. But now, as he crouched in the darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that the night was about to take a dangerous turn. It had all seemed simple just hours ago. Back in Angela's office, the plan was clear: gather evidence, document everything, and get out before Hayes or his men knew they were there. But the reality was far messier. Hayes was no ordinary criminal. He was a man who had built his empire on fear and complicity. He wasn't going to let two people, Angela with her relentless pursuit of truth and Elijah with his youthful defiance, tear it all down. Elijah shifted uncomfortably, the cold metal of the drum pressing against his back. He tried to calm his nerves, but every sound seemed amplified: the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the low murmur of voices from inside the warehouse. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Inside the warehouse, Angela crept along the edge of a shadowy corridor. Her camera hung around her neck, its lens poised to capture evidence that could finally expose the corruption she had spent years chasing. The faint light of a flickering bulb revealed stacks of crates stamped with symbols she didn't recognize, evidence of the smuggling operation she was certain Hayes was running. She paused as voices grew louder, her pulse quickening. Peering around a corner, she saw Hayes standing beside one of the crates, his sharp features illuminated by the pale glow of a single hanging light. Two of his men were with him, their postures tense. On the crate lay the package Mr. Green had described, its brown paper now torn to reveal a small, black ledger. Hayes's voice carried through the cavernous space, low and commanding. "This ledger never leaves this room. Do you understand me? If this gets out, we're finished." Angela's heart raced. The ledger was the key, the thread that could unravel everything. She raised her camera, the click of the shutter barely audible, but even that tiny sound felt deafening in the stillness. One of Hayes's men turned sharply, his eyes scanning the darkness. Outside, Elijah heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching the warehouse. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Another car had pulled up moments ago, and now 3 more men were making their way toward the entrance. They moved with purpose, their silhouettes sharp against the dim light. Elijah knew he should stay hidden, but something told him Angela was in danger. His fear warred with his resolve as he considered his next move. And then, as though on cue, he heard a sharp cry from inside the warehouse. "Angela!" Without thinking, Elijah moved. He crept toward the side of the building, his footsteps light against the cracked pavement. He found a broken window and peered inside. The scene before him made his stomach churn. Angela had been caught. One of Hayes's men had grabbed her, his grip tight around her arm as she struggled against him. Her camera dangled precariously, the strap pulling against her neck. Hayes stood before her, the ledger in one hand, a cold smile on his face. Well, Hayes said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The infamous Angela Brooks. I have to admit, I'm impressed. You've got guts. Coming here." Angela met his gaze, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "The truth has a way of making people bold." Hayes chuckled, shaking his head. "The truth? Let me tell you something about the truth, Ms. Brooks. It doesn't matter. People believe what they're told to believe. And if they don't, well, they're silenced." Elijah's fists clenched as he watched, rage bubbling up inside him. He couldn't let this happen. Not to Angela, not to the truth. In a surge of adrenaline, Elijah pushed himself through the broken window, landing silently on the concrete floor. He moved quickly, staying low, his eyes fixed on the scene ahead. Angela caught sight of him out of the corner of her eye, her expression a mix of relief and warning. Elijah spotted a metal pipe lying nearby and grabbed it, its cold weight reassuring in his hands. He waited, his breath steadying, as Hayes continued to speak. "But you had to push, didn't you?" Hayes said, his smile fading. "You had to dig where you didn't belong. And now, you'll pay the price." Before Hayes could say another word, Elijah sprang into action. He swung the pipe at the man holding Angela, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. The man crumpled to the ground, releasing Angela, who stumbled backward. "Elijah," she gasped, her voice a mix of shock and gratitude. "Run!" Elijah shouted, his eyes locked on Hayes and the 2 remaining men, who were already reaching for their weapons. Angela didn't hesitate. She grabbed the camera from around her neck and bolted toward the exit, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the warehouse. Elijah swung the pipe again, this time at one of Hayes's men. But he wasn't fast enough. The man dodged and lunged at him, knocking the pipe from his hands. Elijah hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his shoulder. Hayes loomed over him, his expression dark. "You should have stayed out of this, kid." But before Hayes could act, the sound of sirens filled the air, their piercing wail cutting through the tension like a knife. Hayes froze, his eyes narrowing. "Cops," one of his men muttered. "We've gotta go." Hayes hesitated, his gaze flicking between Elijah and the approaching sirens. Finally, he cursed under his breath and turned, signaling for his men to follow. Within moments, they were gone, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Angela returned with the police moments later, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. She rushed to Elijah, helping him to his feet as officers began to sweep the warehouse. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. Elijah nodded, though his body ached. "Did you get it? The ledger?" Angela's face lit up with a rare smile. She held up the camera. Every page. For the first time that night, Elijah felt a flicker of hope. The battle was far from over. But they had struck a blow. Hayes had fled, but his secrets were no longer hidden. As the officers led them outside, Elijah looked back at the warehouse. Its shadows still heavy but now pierced by beams of light. The truth was out there now. And it was only a matter of time before Hayes's empire began to crumble. The morning after the warehouse raid began with a quiet that felt unnatural. Like the lull before a storm, Elijah sat in Angela Brooks's office, a makeshift war room where the air was thick with tension and determination. The camera sat on the desk between them, its small screen flickering as they reviewed the photos Angela had taken of the ledger. Each image revealed more than just numbers, it told a story of deception, of how the powerful manipulated systems to keep the vulnerable silent and afraid. Angela's voice broke the silence. "This ledger is the smoking gun. It's not just about Hayes, it's about everyone he's been protecting and working with. Politicians, business leaders, police officers, they're all in here." Elijah leaned forward, his fingers tracing the edges of a photo as though touching it might make it more real. "And what happens when this gets out?" Angela's gaze was steady, but her voice carried an edge of caution. "When this gets out, the people in power will do everything they can to bury it and us with it. This isn't just a story, Elijah. This is war." The first cracks in the system appeared almost immediately. Angela sent copies of the photos to trusted contacts in the media, people who had proven themselves unafraid of backlash. By midday, whispers of the ledger had started to spread, the beginnings of a story that could shake the foundations of the city. But with those whispers came threats, emails with no sender, calls that hung up as soon as Angela answered, and shadowy figures lingering near her office. The threats were expected. What Angela didn't expect was the silence from the police. Despite the evidence they'd handed over at the warehouse, there was no sign of an official investigation. No warrants, no arrests, nothing. "They're stalling," Angela said, pacing her office. "They're trying to buy time to clean this up before it reaches the public." Elijah frowned. "Can't we do anything about it?" Angela stopped, her eyes narrowing as an idea began to take shape. "If they won't act, we'll make it impossible for them not to. We go public. All of it." The plan was risky, but it was their only option. Angela arranged a meeting at a local community center, inviting journalists, activists, and anyone who had ever been touched by Hayes's corruption. Word spread quickly, and by the time the meeting began, the room was filled with faces, some angry, some fearful, but all determined. Angela stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding. "We're here today because the truth matters. Because silence has cost this community too much. And because the system built to protect us has been used to hurt us." She held up the camera, its photos projected onto a screen behind her. "This ledger is proof of what we've always known, that our pain is not accidental. It's planned, it's profitable, and it's time we put an end to it." The room erupted in applause, a cathartic release of years of pent-up frustration. Elijah felt a surge of hope, the energy in the room washing over him like a wave. For the first time, it felt like they weren't alone. But hope was fleeting. As the meeting ended and people began to disperse, Angela received a call that made her face go pale. "Hayes is moving," she said, her voice tight. "He knows we're onto him." "What does that mean?" Elijah asked, his chest tightening. It means he's going to destroy whatever evidence he has left, Angela said, already grabbing her bag. If we don't stop him now, this ledger will be the only proof we have, and that won't be enough. The next hours blurred into chaos. Angela and Elijah drove across the city, following leads from her contacts. Each stop brought more pieces of the puzzle. Documents showing bribes paid to police officers. Emails detailing how politicians were complicit. And testimonies from people who had been threatened or silenced. But with each revelation, the danger grew. At one point, as they left a small print shop where a whistleblower had handed over key files, a black SUV pulled up beside them. The windows rolled down just enough for Elijah to see the glint of a gun barrel. Angela sped away, her hands gripping the wheel tightly, her face set in grim determination. "They're trying to scare us," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "But it won't work." As night fell, they received word that Hayes was at his last stronghold, a luxury penthouse downtown, where he was rumored to be meeting with his most powerful allies. Angela knew this was their chance, the moment to expose the full extent of his network. But it wouldn't be easy. The building was heavily guarded. Its security team likely paid handsomely to look the other way. Angela and Elijah would have to rely on stealth and a bit of luck to get inside. "You don't have to come," Angela said as they parked a few blocks away. "This is dangerous." Elijah shook his head. "Marcus didn't have a choice when they arrested him. I'm not backing down now." Angela smiled faintly, her respect for him evident. "All right, let's do this." The penthouse was a maze of opulence and shadows. Its marble floors and glass walls a stark contrast to the darkness of the secrets it held. Elijah and Angela moved carefully, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. They could hear voices ahead, Hayes and his associates, their conversation laced with urgency and anger. "This ends tonight," Hayes was saying. "We can't let this get out. I want every copy of that ledger destroyed. And those two, their liabilities. Deal with them." Elijah's blood ran cold. He exchanged a glance with Angela, who nodded silently. They crept closer, angling for a better view of the room. Hayes stood at the head of a long table, the ledger in front of him. Around him were men in suits, their faces hard and unforgiving. Angela raised her camera, snapping a series of photos. But the click was louder than they expected, and Hayes's head snapped up. "Who's there?" he barked. Angela grabbed Elijah's arm. "Run." They bolted, the sound of footsteps and shouts close behind. The building became a labyrinth as they ducked and weaved, their breaths coming in sharp gasps. Finally, they burst out onto the rooftop, the city sprawling out before them. Hayes and his men were close behind, their footsteps echoing ominously. Elijah felt his heart pounding, fear coursing through him. But then he remembered why he was here, why this fight mattered. "Over here," Angela shouted, waving down a police helicopter that had been alerted to their location. Its spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the rooftop and forcing Hayes and his men to stop in their tracks. As officers swarmed the building, Angela turned to Elijah, her face lit by the helicopter's beam. "We did it." For the first time that day, Elijah allowed himself to breathe. The next morning dawned cold and clear, a cruel juxtaposition to the storm that was brewing in the hearts of Elijah Reed and Angela Brooks. The events of the rooftop still clung to them like the scent of smoke after a fire. Sharp and inescapable, the ledger was safe now, its pages digitized and encrypted, its secrets exposed to a growing network of journalists and activists. But the battle was far from over. Angela sat at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she composed the article that would ignite the city. The camera rested beside her, a silent witness to everything they had uncovered. Elijah watched her work from a worn chair in the corner, his mind racing with what-ifs. What if Hayes retaliated? What if the system buried this story, just as it had buried so many others? Ruth Reed's voice came softly from the doorway, pulling Elijah from his thoughts. "Baby, you've been quiet since you came home. Are you sure you're all right?" Elijah nodded, though his face betrayed him. "I'm just thinking, Mama, about what's next." Ruth sighed, stepping into the room. "What's next is you keep fighting. But you remember who you are, too. They'll try to make you forget. Don't let them." The article went live at noon. Its headline was stark, uncompromising. A system built on lies. How one man's empire exploited a city. Angela's words painted a vivid picture of corruption. exposing the web Hayes had spun with the complicity of police officers, politicians, and business leaders. The story quickly gained traction, shared and reshared across social media, picked up by national outlets, and debated on cable news. But with visibility came danger. By late afternoon, Angela's inbox was flooded with threats. Anonymous messages poured in, some vague, others disturbingly specific. Elijah received his own share of hate. Whispers at school turning into confrontations in the hallways. "Why do you have to stir things up?" one boy sneered during gym class. "You're making it worse for all of us." Elijah didn't respond, but the words hit their mark. He couldn't ignore the weight of his decisions, the ripple effects that now touched everyone in his orbit. That evening, Elijah and Angela met at the community center, where the energy was electric. People packed the room, their faces a mix of hope and fear. Some were there to share their own stories of injustice, emboldened by the article. Others were there to organize, ready to take action against the systemic corruption that had defined their lives for too long. Angela stood at the front, her voice steady but impassioned. "This is more than a story. It's a call to action. Hayes isn't just one man, he's part of a system that profits off our pain. If we want real change, it starts here, with us." The applause that followed was thunderous. But not everyone was on board. Toward the back of the room, a man raised his hand. "What's stopping them from coming after us?" he asked, his tone sharp. "We've seen what happens to people who speak out. They disappear. They're silenced." Angela didn't flinch. "You're right, there's risk. But silence hasn't kept us safe, has it? It's only kept us oppressed." Elijah stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "They want us to be afraid. They want us to believe we can't win. But we've already taken the first step. We've shown the truth. Now it's time to fight for it." The room fell silent, his words hanging heavy in the air. Slowly, one by one, people began to nod, their fear giving way to determination. But the fight was far from over. That night, as Elijah walked home with Ruth, they noticed a black car idling near their building. Its windows were tinted, its engine humming low and steady. Elijah's stomach knotted. He grabbed his mother's hand, quickening their pace. Inside their apartment, Ruth locked the door behind them, her hands trembling. "They're watching us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Elijah replied, "but we can't stop now." The next few days were a blur of escalating tension. Hayes had gone underground, his network scrambling to cover its tracks. Police raids on his properties yielded more evidence, but also raised questions about how deep the corruption went. Every revelation brought both hope and danger. Each step forward met with resistance. Elijah found himself becoming a symbol for the movement. Whether he wanted to or not, people stopped him on the street to thank him or share their own stories of injustice. Others confronted him, accusing him of putting the community at risk. The weight of their expectations was heavy, but it also fueled his resolve. The breaking point came one evening when Angela received an anonymous tip about a meeting Hayes was planning. It was a last-ditch effort to salvage his operation, bringing together the remnants of his network to regroup and retaliate. The location was a private club on the edge of the city, a fortress of wealth and power. "We can't let this happen," Angela said, pacing her office. "If they regroup, they'll find a way to bury everything we've done." Elijah looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "So, what's the plan?" Angela hesitated, her usual confidence faltering. "The plan is dangerous. We go in, we document everything, and we get out before they know we were there. But if something goes wrong, it won't," Elijah said firmly. "We've come too far to stop now." The night of the meeting was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Elijah and Angela arrived at the club under the cover of darkness. Armed with nothing but a camera and their wits, they found a way in through a side entrance, slipping past security and into the shadows of the opulent building. Inside, the atmosphere was charged. Hayes stood at the center of a long table, his voice calm but commanding. Around him were men and women in suits, their faces hard and unreadable. "This is just a setback," Hayes said, his tone smooth. "We've weathered storms before. We'll weather this one too. But we need to act quickly. The community is restless, and the media is watching. We can't let them gain any more ground." Angela raised her camera, snapping photos as quietly as she could. Elijah stood beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment. the knowledge that this could either be their victory or their undoing. Suddenly, one of Hayes's men turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted them. "Hey, who are you?" "Run," Angela shouted, grabbing Elijah's arm. They bolted, the sound of footsteps and shouts echoing behind them. The halls of the club became a maze, every turn bringing them closer to capture. Finally, they burst through a door and into the night, the cold air hitting them like a slap. Back at Angela's office, they reviewed the photos, their breaths still coming in short gasps. They had captured enough to expose Hayes's plans, enough to keep the fight alive. But as Elijah stared at the images on the screen, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. Hayes was cornered, but a cornered animal was always the most dangerous. Morning broke like a wound, sunlight cutting through the blinds in Angela Brooks's office, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The air was thick with exhaustion, the kind that seeped into the bones and dulled the mind. Elijah sat in the corner, his eyes rimmed with red from a night without sleep, while Angela paced the room, a storm brewing just beneath her calm exterior. The photos they'd taken at Hayes' meeting had gone live hours ago, the story breaking across news outlets like a thunderclap. The images were damning. Hayes surrounded by his inner circle, mapping out strategies to silence dissent and reassert control. The public response had been immediate and fierce. Protests were planned, petitions circulated, and calls for justice echoed across social media. But beneath the surface, the undercurrents of fear and resistance were undeniable. The people they were fighting against were not only powerful, they were desperate. And desperation, Angela reminded Elijah, was dangerous. It started small, as these things often do. A car with tinted windows idling outside the community center where protesters were gathering. A phone call to Angela's office that began with silence and ended with a quiet, menacing laugh. A brick thrown through the window of a local activist's home. A note tied to it with the words, "Keep your mouth shut." The fear was palpable, but so was the resolve. Elijah watched as the community rallied, their voices growing louder despite the threats. It was inspiring, but it also made him nervous. He'd seen what happened when people pushed too hard, too fast. The system didn't just push back, it crushed. "Do you think they'll stop us?" Elijah asked Angela one evening as they worked late in her office, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her tired face. Angela didn't look up from her work. "They're trying to stop us because they know we're winning. But we can't afford to stop now. Not when we're this close." Elijah nodded, her words a lifeline he clung to, even as doubt gnawed at him. The tipping point came 3 days later. A protest outside City Hall had drawn hundreds. A sea of voices demanding accountability and change. Elijah stood in the crowd, the energy around him electrifying. Angela was at the front, a bullhorn in hand, her voice carrying over the din. "We will not be silenced," she shouted. Her words met with a roar of agreement. "This is our city, and we will not let corruption define it." The crowd surged, their chants growing louder. But then, as if on cue, the police arrived. Dozens of officers in riot gear formed a wall, their presence a stark reminder of the power they were up against. The tension was immediate, a sharp crackle in the air as the two sides faced off. Elijah's heart pounded as he watched. He'd been at protests before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, the anger more volatile. He caught sight of Hayes in the distance, standing behind the line of officers, his expression cold and calculating. The sight made Elijah's blood boil. And then, it happened. A bottle flew through the air, smashing against the ground near the police line. It wasn't clear who threw it, but the effect was immediate. The officers surged forward, their batons raised, and chaos erupted. Elijah found himself caught in the middle, the crowd pushing and pulling as people tried to escape. The air filled with the sound of shouting, the sharp crack of batons meeting flesh, the wail of sirens. He ducked as a tear gas canister flew overhead, its acrid smoke stinging his eyes and throat. "Stay close," Angela's voice cut through the chaos, her hand grabbing his arm and pulling him toward safety. They stumbled into an alley, gasping for air as the sounds of the clash continued behind them. "Are you okay?" Angela asked, her eyes scanning him for injuries. Elijah nodded, though his chest felt tight. "What now?" Angela's face hardened. "Now, we fight harder. They think they can scare us into silence. But all they've done is prove why this fight is necessary. The fallout from the protest was immediate and devastating. Headlines painted the demonstrators as violent agitators, ignoring the heavy-handed response of the police. Hayes held a press conference, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I understand the frustrations of the community," he said, his voice measured, "but we cannot allow lawlessness to prevail. My focus is on restoring order and ensuring the safety of all our citizens." Elijah watched the broadcast with clenched fists. "He's turning this against us." Angela nodded, her expression grim. "That's what they do. They weaponize fear. But we have something they don't: the truth. And we're going to make sure everyone sees it." The next step was risky. But they had no choice. Angela decided to hold a public forum, inviting anyone who had been impacted by Hayes' corruption to share their stories. It was a chance to reclaim the narrative, to show the world the human cost of the system Hayes and his allies had built. The forum was held in the gym of a local high school, its bleachers packed with people from all walks of life. Elijah sat in the front row, his heart heavy as one by one people stood to speak. A mother whose son had been falsely imprisoned. A shop owner forced to pay bribes just to stay in business. A teenager beaten by police for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each story was a gut punch, a reminder of the insidiousness of the system they were fighting. But it was also a rallying cry, a testament to the strength of a community refusing to be silenced. As the night wore on, Elijah found himself called to the stage. His legs felt like lead as he walked to the microphone, the weight of the room pressing down on him. He looked out at the sea of faces, their eyes filled with expectation, and took a deep breath. "My name is Elijah Reed," he began, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "And I've seen what happens when people like Hayes are allowed to operate in the shadows. They destroy lives, they destroy communities, and they count on us to stay quiet." He paused, the silence in the room deafening. "But we're not staying quiet anymore. We're here because we believe in something bigger than their lies. We believe in justice, and we won't stop until we get it." The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of hope and defiance that carried them through the night. But as Elijah and Angela left the gym, the glow of the evening was dimmed by a grim realization. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. Hayes and his allies were cornered. And cornered animals were the most dangerous. Angela turned to Elijah, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You did good tonight, but things are going to get harder. Are you ready for that?" Elijah met her gaze, his resolve unshakable. "I've been ready." The days that followed the public forum were an uneasy mixture of triumph and tension. The stories shared that night had gone viral, amplified by social media and picked up by national news outlets. Faces once hidden in the shadows were now emblazoned on television screens, their voices echoing across a country grappling with its conscience. But the light they had shown came at a cost. Threats became more pointed, the line between vigilance and fear blurred. Elijah Reed felt it in every step he took, every corner he turned. The weight of his newfound role was both invigorating and suffocating. He had become a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. But symbols, he realized, were easier to attack than people. One morning, as Elijah walked to Angela Brooks's office, he noticed a car trailing him. It was subtle, deliberate, a vehicle that would slow when he slowed and turn when he turned. His heartbeat quickened, but he forced himself to keep moving. The distance to Angela's building seemed to stretch endlessly, every step heavier than the last. When he finally reached the door, he glanced back. The car had stopped at the curb, its engine idling. The windows were tinted, concealing whoever sat inside. Elijah froze, his hand on the doorknob. Before forcing himself to step inside, he shut the door firmly behind him, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Angela looked up from her desk, her expression sharp. "What happened?" "There's a car outside," Elijah said, his voice tight. "It's been following me." Angela's face hardened. "They're trying to intimidate you. Don't let them see you're afraid." "I'm not afraid," Elijah said, though his trembling hands betrayed him. "I'm angry." The anger fueled them in the days that followed. Angela and Elijah worked tirelessly, combing through new evidence and preparing for the next wave of their fight. The ledger had been a treasure trove of information, but it also painted a picture of how deep the rot ran. Corruption didn't stop with Hayes, it spread like a disease, infecting everything it touched. One name, in particular, stood out: Councilman Robert Price. A rising star in local politics with a carefully cultivated image as a champion of the people. But the ledger told a different story. Payments funneled through shell companies. Deals struck in back rooms. Price wasn't just complicit, he was a key player. If we expose Price, we expose the whole operation, Angela said, her voice edged with determination. But he's going to fight back. Hard. Then we fight harder, Elijah replied, his resolve unwavering. The opportunity came sooner than they expected. Price was hosting a fundraiser at a luxurious downtown hotel. An event billed as a celebration of his commitment to community revitalization. The irony wasn't lost on Angela or Elijah as they made their plans. We need someone on the inside, Angela said, someone who can get close enough to record him without raising suspicion. Elijah knew what she was asking. He also knew the risks. I'll do it, he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could second-guess himself. Angela hesitated, her concern evident. You're sure? Elijah nodded. If we don't do this, everything we've worked for could fall apart. The night of the fundraiser was a blur of bright lights and muted whispers. Elijah walked through the grand ballroom, dressed in a suit borrowed from a neighbor. He felt out of place among the polished attendees, their laughter ringing hollow against the weight of his purpose. A small recording device was hidden in his pocket, its presence both comforting and terrifying. He spotted Price near the bar, surrounded by a group of well-dressed supporters. The councilman exuded confidence, his smile warm and practiced. Elijah approached cautiously, keeping his movements casual. Councilman Price, he said, extending a hand. Big fan of your work. Price turned, his smile widening as he took Elijah's hand. Well, thank you. Always glad to meet a supporter. And you are? Elijah Reed, he replied smoothly. I've been following your initiatives in the community. Really impressive stuff. Price's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile didn't waver. It's all about giving back. We have to take care of the people who make this city what it is. The words felt like poison, but Elijah forced himself to nod. Absolutely. I'd love to hear more about your vision. Price gestured for him to follow, leading him to a quieter corner of the room. Elijah's heart raced as he activated the recorder in his pocket. What's on your mind, Elijah? Price asked, his tone friendly but probing. Elijah hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. I've been hearing some interesting things about the revitalization projects. People say you've got some innovative partnerships in the works. Price's smile faltered, just slightly. Well, innovation is the name of the game. But you know how these things are, lots of moving parts. Not everyone needs to know all the details. That makes sense, Elijah said, keeping his tone casual. But transparency is important, right? Especially when it comes to public trust. Price's eyes darkened, his smile turning cold. Transparency is a luxury, Elijah. Sometimes, you have to make hard decisions for the greater good. People don't always understand that. Elijah's stomach churned, but he pressed on. And those decisions, do they include Hayes? Price stiffened, his gaze sharp. For a moment, the mask slipped, revealing the man beneath. I don't know what you're talking about. Elijah held his ground. I think you do. And so do a lot of other people. The confrontation ended abruptly when one of Price's aides appeared, whispering something in his ear. Price shot Elijah a warning look before walking away, his polished demeanor replaced by barely concealed anger. Elijah slipped out of the hotel as quickly as he could, his heart pounding. Outside, Angela was waiting in her car. He climbed in, his hands shaking as he handed her the recorder. Did you get it? She asked. Elijah nodded, enough to show who he really is. Angela smiled, a rare expression of genuine pride. You did good, Elijah, really good. But as they drove away, a car began to follow them. Angela noticed it first, her sharp eyes catching the headlights in the rearview mirror. She didn't say anything at first, but when the car made the same turn they did twice, her jaw tightened. They're following us, she said, her voice low. Elijah's pulse quickened. What do we do? Angela pressed down on the accelerator. We lose them. The next few minutes were a blur of sharp turns and speeding through empty streets. The pursuing car stayed close, its engine roaring as it tried to keep up. Elijah gripped the seat, his mind racing with fear and adrenaline. Finally, Angela swerved into an alley, killing the headlights and engine. They sat in silence, their breaths shallow as they watched the car speed past. Back at Angela's office, the weight of the night settled over them. The recording was a victory. But the risks were mounting. They were being watched, hunted, by forces that saw them as a threat. Are we in over our heads? Elijah asked quietly. Angela looked at him, her eyes fierce. Probably. But that's how you know you're doing something right. The city felt different, as though it had been holding its breath since the fundraiser. There was a tension in the air, palpable and heavy, as if everyone knew something was coming but couldn't yet see it. Elijah Reed walked through the streets with a wary awareness, his footsteps quick but purposeful. The recording he and Angela had obtained was a time bomb waiting to go off. And they were the ones lighting the fuse. Angela's office had become a fortress. Its blinds drawn, its locks checked twice each time someone entered or left. The hum of her computer was constant, accompanied by the tap of her fingers on the keyboard and the steady buzz of her phone. The weight of their fight was etched into her face. But so was a grim determination. Are we ready? Elijah asked, his voice breaking the silence. Angela didn't look up. Almost. The recording goes live tonight. Once it's out there, there's no going back. Elijah nodded, his stomach knotting. He knew what that meant. The system wasn't just going to fight back, it was going to unleash everything it had. The hours before the release crawled by. Angela had sent copies of the recording to trusted allies in the media, ensuring that no matter what happened to them, the truth would come to light. But even with those precautions, the danger felt closer than ever. The car outside her office hadn't moved all day. The shadow of its presence loomed, a silent reminder of what they were up against. Do you think they'll try something? Elijah asked, glancing at the car through the slats of the blinds. They already are, Angela replied. That car is a warning. They're letting us know they're watching. Then why not stop us? Elijah pressed, frustration creeping into his voice. Angela turned to him, her gaze sharp. Because they don't want to be seen as desperate. Not yet, but once this goes live, that changes. Desperation makes people dangerous. As the sun set, the tension in the office grew unbearable. Angela checked the recording one last time, ensuring it was ready for release. The audio was damning Price's thinly veiled admissions, his dismissive remarks about transparency, and his clear connection to Hayes. It was enough to destroy him. It's time, Angela said, her voice steady. She clicked a button, and with it, the recording went live. Within minutes, it was being shared across social media, picked up by news outlets, and dissected by commentators. Elijah watched the screen, his heart pounding. The comments poured in, a mix of outrage, disbelief, and support. The truth was out there now, and it couldn't be taken back. But as the night wore on, the cost of their actions became clear. Around midnight, the power in the office cut out. Angela and Elijah froze, the sudden darkness wrapping around them like a shroud. The hum of the computer was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. And then came the sound of footsteps outside. Stay calm, Angela whispered, reaching for her phone to turn on its flashlight. She motioned for Elijah to follow her as she moved toward the back of the office. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. There was a knock, slow and deliberate. Ms. Brooks, a voice called. It was calm, almost polite. We'd like to talk. Angela didn't respond. She gestured for Elijah to stay quiet, her hand gripping his arm to steady him. The knock came again, harder this time, and then, without warning, the door burst open. The men who entered were dressed in dark suits, their movements efficient and controlled. They weren't police, but their presence carried the same authority, the same unspoken threat. One of them stepped forward, his expression cold. You've made things very difficult for us, he said, his tone devoid of emotion. We're here to offer you a chance to stop before it gets worse. Angela's voice was steady, though her hand trembled. You're wasting your time. The recording is already out there. There's nothing you can do to stop it. The man's expression didn't change. We can make life very uncomfortable for you. For both of you. Think carefully about your next move. Elijah's anger flared. You think you can scare us into silence? It's too late for that. The man turned his gaze to Elijah, his eyes narrowing. Bravery is admirable, but it's also dangerous. Angela stepped between them. Get out, now. For a moment, the men hesitated, as though considering their next move. Then, without another word, they turned and left, the sound of their footsteps fading into the night. The aftermath of the intrusion left Angela and Elijah shaken but resolute. The power returned an hour later, and with it came a flood of messages. The recording had gone viral, its impact spreading far beyond their city. News anchors dissected every word, while activists called for Price's resignation and an investigation into his ties to Hayes. But with the momentum came backlash. Price held a press conference the next morning, his demeanor calm but defensive. "These allegations are baseless," he said, his tone measured. "They are the work of individuals who seek to undermine the progress we've made as a city. I have always acted in the best interests of my constituents." Elijah watched the broadcast with clenched fists. "He's lying. Everyone knows he's lying." Angela nodded, her expression grim. "But he's not talking to us. He's talking to the people who want to believe him." That night, as Elijah walked home, he noticed the car again. It wasn't trailing him this time, it was parked in front of his building. Two men leaned against it, their faces hidden in the shadows. Elijah hesitated, his pulse quickening. One of the men stepped forward, his voice low. "You've been making a lot of noise, kid. That's dangerous." Elijah stood his ground, though his legs felt like they might give out. "You can't scare me." The man chuckled, a cold sound that sent a shiver down Elijah's spine. "We'll see." He turned and got back into the car, the engine roaring to life. As it sped away, Elijah felt a mix of relief and dread. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The city seemed to vibrate with unease, like a wire stretched too tight, threatening to snap. The fallout from the recording was immediate and explosive. Councilman Robert Price found himself at the center of a firestorm, his reputation unraveling in real time. Protests grew louder, demands for justice echoed through the streets, and every corner of the city seemed caught in a battle between truth and power. But Elijah Reed and Angela Brooks knew this was the most dangerous moment yet. It was the point where those who held power would stop at nothing to protect it. The first signs of escalation came early. Elijah awoke to find his phone flooded with messages, some of support, but many laced with venom. Threats of violence, slurs, and promises that he'd regret his involvement. Ruth found a brick on their porch that morning, wrapped in a note scrawled with the words, "You're next." Elijah stared at it, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "They're trying to scare us." Ruth placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Fear is their weapon, Elijah, but courage is yours. Don't let them win." At Angela's office, the tension was palpable. The media frenzy surrounding the recording had forced the city's leaders to respond. The mayor announced an investigation into Price's dealings, and a grand jury was convened to examine the evidence. But Angela wasn't satisfied. "They're stalling," she said, pacing the room. "This isn't about justice, it's damage control. They're hoping the noise will die down so they can bury it." "So, what do we do?" Elijah asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Angela stopped pacing, her eyes fierce. "We keep pushing. We find more evidence, more witnesses. We make it impossible for them to ignore us." That night, they got a lead. A whistleblower, someone who had worked closely with Hayes, was willing to talk. The meeting was arranged in secret, a late-night rendezvous at a diner on the outskirts of the city. Angela and Elijah arrived early, their nerves taut as they scanned the room. The man arrived 10 minutes later, a wiry figure with a nervous energy. He introduced himself as Martin, his voice low and trembling. "I know what Hayes has been doing," he said. "I kept records, payments, deals, names, but if they find out I'm talking, they won't," Angela assured him. "We'll protect you." Martin glanced around the diner, his paranoia evident. "There's a storage unit," he said, his words spilling out in a rush. "Everything's there. Documents, recordings. It's enough to take him down." Elijah's heart raced. "Where is it?" Martin scribbled an address on a napkin and slid it across the table. "But be careful. They're watching it. They know how much is at stake." The next morning, Angela and Elijah drove to the storage unit, their tension mounting with every mile. The address led them to an industrial area on the city's edge, a row of identical units stretching into the distance. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and rust, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. As they approached the unit, Angela's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. "It's Martin. He says he's being followed." "Do you think it's a trap?" Elijah asked, his voice tight. Angela shook her head. "I don't know, but we don't have a choice." Inside the storage unit, the evidence was overwhelming. Boxes of documents, hard drives, and folders filled with incriminating information. Angela's hands trembled as she opened a file, her eyes scanning its contents. "This is it," she whispered. "This is everything." But their relief was short-lived. As they began loading the evidence into their car, they heard the crunch of gravel outside. Elijah peeked through the door and froze. A black SUV had pulled up, its windows tinted. Two men stepped out, their movements purposeful. "They're here," Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. Angela grabbed his arm, her expression fierce. "We need to get out of here. Now." The next moments were a blur of panic and adrenaline. Angela and Elijah scrambled to load as much evidence as they could, their hands shaking as the men outside approached. The sound of the SUV's engine idling was a low, menacing hum. As the men reached the door, Angela threw it open, clutching a file in her hand. "Looking for something?" she called, her voice steady despite the tension. The men froze, their eyes narrowing. "You've made a mistake," one of them said, his tone cold. "Give us the evidence, and we'll let you walk away." Angela laughed, a sharp, defiant sound. "You're not getting anything, and even if you did, it's too late. This isn't just here, it's everywhere now." The man's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Angela had called the police as they drove to the unit, knowing they might need backup. The men exchanged a glance before retreating to their SUV. As they sped away, Angela and Elijah watched, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Back at Angela's office, they began sorting through the evidence, their exhaustion giving way to determination. The files contained everything Martin had promised: bank statements, emails, surveillance footage. It was a roadmap of corruption, implicating not just Hayes and Price, but a network of powerful individuals across the city. "This changes everything," Angela said, her voice filled with both awe and resolve. Elijah nodded, his eyes scanning a document in his hands. "But it's not over. They're going to fight harder now. They're going to come after us." Angela placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "Let them. We've come too far to stop now." The morning of the trial dawned gray and heavy, the kind of day that felt poised on the edge of something monumental. Elijah Reed stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the city that had become both a battleground and a beacon. The streets below were already alive with activity, protesters chanting, reporters setting up their cameras, and police officers forming tense lines. Today wasn't just a day in court. It was a day of reckoning. Angela Brooks was already at the courthouse when Elijah arrived, her energy electric despite the long night they'd spent preparing. The files they'd recovered from the storage unit had been handed over to the district attorney, their contents now central to the case against Councilman Price and Hayes. The courtroom was packed, the tension almost suffocating. "Are you ready?" Angela asked, her voice low as they took their seats near the front. Elijah nodded, though his hands trembled. "I've been ready." The opening argument set the stage for what was to come. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of corruption, their words underscored by the evidence Angela and Elijah had risked everything to uncover. Bank transfers, recorded conversations, and testimonies from whistleblowers formed a web that tightened around the defendants with each passing moment. Price sat stiffly at the defense table, his expression carefully neutral. Hayes, by contrast, exuded arrogance, his occasional smirk a reminder of the power he once wielded. But as the evidence mounted, even he couldn't hide the cracks forming in his facade. When it was Elijah's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. He felt the weight of every eye in the room as he walked to the witness stand, his heart pounding in his chest. The oath felt heavy in his mouth, the words carrying a gravity he couldn't ignore. The prosecutor began with simple questions, easing Elijah into his testimony. But soon, the questions grew sharper, cutting to the heart of his involvement. "Mr. Reed, can you describe the night you and Ms. Brooks retrieved the evidence from the storage unit?" Elijah took a deep breath. "We knew it was dangerous, but we also knew we couldn't let that evidence disappear. It wasn't just about us, it was about everyone who's been hurt by this system." "And when you were confronted by Hayes' men, what did they say?" "They told us to walk away," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "They said they'd make our lives difficult if we didn't." "And why didn't you?" the prosecutor asked, leaning forward. Elijah met their gaze, his voice firm. "Because the truth matters. Because people like Hayes and Price have gotten away with this for too long. Someone had to stand up to them." The defense tried to discredit him, their questions laced with insinuations and accusations. They painted him as a naive young man manipulated by Angela, a troublemaker looking for attention. But Elijah held his ground, his answers clear and unwavering. By the time he stepped down from the stand, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. The defense's attempts to undermine him had only highlighted his courage. Outside the courthouse, the protests swelled. The crowd was a mix of hope and anger, their chants a rallying cry that echoed through the city. Signs demanded accountability, their words sharp and uncompromising. Among the protesters were faces Elijah recognized: neighbors, classmates, and strangers who had been moved by the fight for justice. But there were also counter-protesters, their voices sharp and angry. They accused Elijah and Angela of stirring up trouble, of dividing the community. The police stood between the two groups, their presence a reminder of how easily things could spiral out of control. Inside, the trial reached its crescendo. The prosecution unveiled the final piece of evidence, a video recovered from the storage unit. It showed Price and Hayes in a private meeting, their conversation a chilling admission of their crimes. "We control the narrative," Hayes said, his voice calm. "People believe what we tell them to believe." "And what about the ones who don't?" Price asked. Hayes smirked. "We make them regret it." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, and even a few cheers filled the air as the judge banged their gavel for order. Hayes' smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl, while Price's face drained of color. The closing arguments were a battle of wills. The prosecution emphasized the human cost of the defendant's actions, the lives ruined, the trust shattered, the systemic harm inflicted on the community. The defense clung to technicalities, their arguments increasingly desperate. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Hours felt like days as everyone waited for the verdict. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, their expression unreadable as they handed the verdict to the judge. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendants guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted in cheers. Elijah felt tears sting his eyes as the weight of the moment hit him. Angela squeezed his hand, her expression a mixture of relief and triumph. Outside, the crowd roared as the verdict was announced. The line between hope and justice blurred, the atmosphere electric with possibility. Elijah stepped outside, greeted by a sea of faces looking to him as a symbol of what was possible. "You did it," Angela said, her voice barely audible over the noise. "We did it," Elijah corrected, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "All of us." That night, as the city celebrated, Elijah sat with Ruth on their porch. The sounds of cheers and music drifted through the air, a testament to the power of collective action. "I'm proud of you," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. "You stood up when it mattered most." Elijah nodded, the weight of the fight still heavy but bearable. "We showed them the truth. That's what matters." As the stars came out, the city felt different, lighter, freer. The fight wasn't over, but it had reached a turning point. The shadows of corruption had been pierced, and the light of justice was beginning to shine through.